Hello. Hi, welcome. On behalf of the Center for Public Justice Families Valued campaign, welcome. My name is Catherine Freeman, and I will be the moderator for today's conversation. In addition to serving as a consultant on this project, I'm in my last year of seminary at Baylor's Truett Seminary. Previously, I served for 5 years as the Director of Public Policy for the Texas Baptist Christian Life Commission. I am an attorney and I've spent 10 years working on public policy, both in the state of Texas where I live and nationally. Thank you again for joining us today. I thought I might begin by framing our conversation today. COVID-19 has upended the lives of millions of Americans and highlighted the deficiency in family-friendly workplace policies. When the pandemic began, the United States lacked a universal mechanism to guarantee workers paid sick days or the flexibility to care for the children and loved ones while they were. Why are these systems absent? What about history teaches us about the relationship between work and family life? What light might Christian ethics and practice offer to move us forward? To tease the end of the webinar, Families Valued has a view about this, and we have been advocating for several pro-family work policies to be included in the next round of pandemic recovery. We'd love for you to join us in signing on to our open letter to Congress that we'll drop into the chat and share in a follow-up email after we're done today. COVID-19 has forced several concerns about work that have been lingering for some time. First, what basic protections are available to those who work? And second, how do those who need to work also take care of children and family members when they need to? Is accommodation for caregiving a regular feature of work in the United States or an outlier? As you can see on the screen, as you consider sort of the basic protections of paid time off, you can see sort of where the US falls and where we're showing deficiencies. As you can see, the US has never had such a guarantee. Instead, the US model of paid sick days are determined by employer and employee negotiation. In the 1940s and 50s, unionized workers could negotiate for paid time off as part of their contracts. Many women and Americans of color who were for many decades less likely to be represented by a union could not secure these benefits. Paid sick days never became a universal standard for those of us who work in the US. Consequently, when COVID-19 began, nearly a quarter of the US workforce had no paid time off for illness. Despite some gains in the workforce as a whole, usually for higher income, high wage workers, paid sick days remain uncommon for the lowest wage workers, as you can see from the slide. How did this situation come to be? And why are basic protections missing for many who work? The second question prompted by the pandemic is how do those who need to work and also take care of children and family members, how do they do that when they need to? As schools have closed and often childcare became unavailable, suddenly millions of families were managing work and childcare all at once. In March, Congress passed an emergency paid family leave provision together with emergency paid sick days. But this law has significant limitations, including its restrictions to workplaces with fewer than 500 employees. So large employers like Tyson, Amazon, and Walmart are exempt under that law. And many people whose jobs have shifted online found themselves in a perpetual parenting and working mode. So with that said, I want to introduce you to our panelists today who will be leading us out in this conversation. I'll begin with Dr. Julie Rubio, who is a professor of social ethics at Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University in Berkeley, California. From 1999 to 2018, she taught at St. Louis University in St. Louis, Missouri. She is the author of 4 books, including Family Ethics, Practices for Christians, and A Christian Theology of Marriage and Family. Her articles have appeared in many academic journals and in popular venues such as America, the National Catholic Reporter, and The Conversation. Her work is marked by a commitment to finding common ground and by a desire to address ethical issues people face in everyday life. Next, we have Joana Meyes, who serves as Denver Institute's Director of Public Engagement and oversees the Women in Vocation Initiative. Prior to coming to the Institute, Joana worked in global telecom, nonprofit counseling, and campus ministry with Crew. She served as an associate faculty at Denver Seminary. She has an MA in social entrepreneurship from Bakke University and has graduated magna cum laude from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Last but certainly not least, I want to say all of the titles. Reverend Dr. Gabriel Salguaro is the pastor of the Gathering Place, a Latino-led multi-ethnic Assemblies of God congregation in Orlando, Florida. He is also the president and founder of the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, a national coalition of several thousand evangelical coalitions in the United States. He has written extensively about the ethical framework, creating an ethical framework for Christians to think about public policy related to issues such as immigration, multicultural ministry, race, and spirituality in public work. He has been named one of the nation's most prominent Latino evangelical leaders by the New York Times, Huffington Post, the New York Observer, the Center for American Progress, El Diario, CNN Español, NBC, Universal, Univision, and Jorge Ramos's Al Punto. Welcome to our panelists. We're excited to have you with us today. So I'll begin with a question for Gabe. Historically speaking, what kinds of work and whose work has received benefits and protections like paid sick leave in the United States? How have disparities in the jobs and the job benefits that workers have access to affected Latino families in the United States?
Catherine, thank you, and so honored to be on with these distinguished panelists whose life's work is making people's lives help them flourish. So I'm so honored by that. Look, I think that it's probably not going to be a surprise to most people that there's a chasm on this paid family leave between people who are in lower income jobs and those who are in higher income jobs. That's one. Number two, if we're talking about the immigrant community, particularly undocumented immigrant communities, they're certainly historically and presently not a part of those conversations. And so, and the thirdly, as you've mentioned earlier in your presentation, those who may work in stores or companies who are larger, right, and who historically have a lower salary or wage. And so those three communities among them have historically been left out of this kind of paid family leave benefit. It's I should say that since we are celebrating Women's History Month, this disproportionately impacts women. And so there is also that major group, which is the majority of society, that is left out of that. It's a surprising thing for me. I'm a US born Latino. I'm a Jersey Rican. That means I'm a Puerto Rican born in New Jersey. That in Latin America, there are some countries who are really pushing ahead of us in the US on some of these issues. And for that, I'm grateful for their leadership, and I'm hopeful that we would follow, I think, is the two things that I want to say. I want to also say that as a father who has stayed at home while my wife was the majority income maker in my house, I remember the stigma, the social and cultural stigma attached to that. And so I think that there's social and cultural capital that's tied, or should I say, social or cultural disdain sometimes tied for men who want to stay home. And on the Latino end, and this is, I'm glad you asked that question, and I don't think it's unique to Latinos, but other cultures who have multi-generational families living at home, who want to do elder care, who have, in the case of my parents, who had my grandfather and grandmother who were living with Alzheimer's, and there was a lot of elder care. The real challenge of elder care in Latino families and other families that have had multi-generational families living together presents a continued challenge as we speak about this. I think that for me, St. Augustine is illustrative and perhaps helpful in that we need to see what is the summa bonum. What is the highest good when we talk about paid family leave? What is the highest good for families? What is the highest good for society? And what is the highest good, and here, even on the economic side, for productivity and health in the workplace? And so as the workplace in America continues to diversify, right, there are 60 million Latinos. We're the largest racial ethnic minority in the United States. As we continue to diversify, this will be a continued conversation on how we see work in the growing plurality and diversity of America. There's much more to say, but I think those are just some initial thoughts in that regard.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salguaro. Dr. Rubio, as we mentioned in the introduction, a second seeming wake-up call during the pandemic has been the fact that many who work are also involved in family care. Yet this is not a new reality and is particularly salient, as Dr. Salguaro mentioned, for women in the workplace. When you entered the workforce, were workers' family care responsibilities acknowledged and supported?
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, when I entered the workforce, I was entering academia, essentially. So I was a teaching assistant and then later an adjunct professor. And while it's important to acknowledge that that's a place of great privilege, right, there really was no sense that people who got pregnant and had babies were in this place. There was really nothing there for us. So as someone who had 2 pregnancies during my doctoral work, much to the chagrin of my advisors who advised against it vociferously, yeah, I had nothing. So so I had to work it out. And I ended up having some difficulties in my pregnancy, which meant that I needed to not walk around, which made teaching difficult. And I relied on the teaching for my funding. And so I just had to work it out myself. I went to work pregnant and sat on the desk and taught. I got some substitutes on my own, and I planned my pregnancies for the end of semesters so that I could take that leave on my own. I was very lucky, though, because I had a husband who had a steady job as a high school teacher, so he was home in the afternoons and on vacations. He was home in the summertime. And so that enabled us to work it out. It was difficult, but it wasn't impossible. I think it's important to acknowledge that universities have come a long way, not as far as they need to go. There are now some things in place, especially for tenure track employees, that just weren't there. They certainly weren't there for teaching assistants. They weren't there for adjuncts, and most of the time they still aren't for those classes. They are more so there for tenure track employees. But even there, not completely. Often when women get tenure, women on the tenure line get leave, it's assumed to be research leave with the expectation, well, you're home with a baby, I'm sure you can write a book on the side. Or there's a tacit assumption, at least, that work continues because how hard could it really be? Right. So we really still haven't integrated into our understanding of work that there can be pauses a couple of times in most people's lives for when children come into the picture.
Yes, that is so fascinating that you're expected to work while you're home nursing a baby. So Joanna, if we've talked a little bit about academia, if you could talk from the perspective of your work with Christian business leaders and individuals in various stages of their career who want to integrate faith with work. As we've heard from Gabe and Julie, there are some structural gaps as to whose work is protected and how caregiving is accommodated in the workplace.
See colossal gaps. And I'm going to speak primarily from my work on the Women in Vocation Initiative, because I think in the area of caretaking, we still see that some of the structural barriers affect women in a profound way. But that's also acknowledging, as Dr. Salguaro said, that there are seasons that men are feeling significant caretaking responsibilities. And I think both men and women will benefit from attempts to address some of these gaps. But for the purposes of today's conversation, I'm going to specifically address what we're seeing in women's lives. And in 2020, it was absolutely mind-blowing the impact that the pandemic had on women's lives. Economists have referred to this season as the she-cession, try saying that 5 times fast, because women have been so distinctly and profoundly affected. And what has been so amazing about this season is that it has affected women across the socioeconomic spectrum. And so it isn't as if we've seen new barriers developing during the pandemic, but the pandemic applied pressure to some existing brokenness in our systems and just broke them wide open. And so the one opportunity that we have in this season is to acknowledge by seeing some of these challenges and responding to them. It's an invitation for us to be making change. So here's some stuff that we're seeing from where we sit at Denver Institute. Women's employment rates are at their lowest since the end of World War II. I mean, it is mind-blowing. In September of last year, 800,000 women left the workforce. Well, actually 800,000 employees left the workforce, and the ratio of women to men was 4 to 1. And that was primarily because in September, everybody was going back to school, and it was impossible for caretakers, in this case women, as you can see by the data, to be able to both work and parent at the same time. So if we start on the lower wage earning spectrum, economically, women often in essential work. I really appreciate what Dr. Ashwin Basan of Columbia University said. He said, people want to talk about the virus as an equal opportunity pathogen, but it's really not. It's going to the fissures of our society. And that is so true. So in this last season, 1 in 3 women's jobs was deemed essential, often because they were in public facing work, whether that was in healthcare or manning the grocery store. At the same time, we saw women losing jobs in industries that were so distinctly hit of retail, hospitality, hotels were closing, restaurants were closing, and that was primarily affecting women. So what was so hard for women that have low wages is that they just didn't have a recourse. If free public childcare was available through school systems, when those left, there was no way to be able to afford outside childcare and still be able to work at the same time. I mean, think about some of these stats. 5.8 million people work healthcare jobs that pay less than $30,000 a year. That's not our nurses and doctors. These are the people that are certified nursing assistants or people that are cleaning our hospitals. Less than $30,000 a year is just hard to even make a living on that. 83% of the people in those jobs are women, and they're often women of color. And so we look at that and we say, yeah, these are the people that cannot afford not to be working at that level. And yet, because they're in essential services work, they're having the highest exposure to COVID. I mean, it's just been just crippling to think about what they have been facing. So whether you're working in a grocery store, you're working in one of the retail organizations that stayed open, or you're in healthcare, when you have that kind of income and you don't have money coming in because you get sick because of a COVID exposure, what choice do you have? Or you see women who are at that level of the economic spectrum when their kids weren't having daycare provided, and because of social distancing, an older family member couldn't step in, or a neighbor to help provide your kids, you were left with this almost impossible task of choosing between parenting and actually working to support your family. So when we think about barriers, some of those structural things that are just baked in to these low wage jobs that are employment but aren't good work are critical and will need to be addressed moving forward. As we think about women on the other end of the economic spectrum, they were dealing with what I call the COVID trifecta of trying to work from home, parent, and also educate their kids because schools were closed. And there was a report that came out from McKinsey and Sheryl Sandberg's organization Lean In that found that 1 in 4 women in corporate jobs were seriously considered either leaving or downsizing their jobs because they just couldn't make it work in this season. And what has been particularly hard as you talk about barriers in corporate life is that employers' expectations haven't changed for the women in their workforce. A female CEO I know who runs one of the largest female-owned organizations in Silicon Valley said that the CEOs are watching the women in their companies log onto their emails at 4 a.m. in just some effort to be able to keep up with the workload because they're not getting uninterrupted time away from their kids to get their work done. In that report by Lean In, one mom had commented, she said, "We're still expected to meet, if not exceed, all of our targets. The pandemic hasn't affected anything as far as what we're required to get done. They tell us you just need to figure it out." And so we have found that expectation, that sense that your call to work is separated from your call to care for your family has been just crippling for women in this season. And I'll quick sum this up in a minute. Structurally, I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of corporate life has been built around a lifestyle that works for an employee leaving the home and having someone stay at home working. Historically, that has been men. You look at even like our highway design in the United States, often commutes are designed around a single shot interstate system that'll take you to an urban core. Well, that works. If you're an employee that's leaving the home for the day, you're going to stay downtown for 45 hours that week to work. You're not juggling anything else, nothing related to caretaking your day. That kind of commute works. But the reality is often for women who really are carrying these caretaking roles of child health care appointments, caring for aging parents, that's not what their commute needs to look like. They need a lot of short little runs at the start or the end of their day to take their kid to the doctor or to check up on a parent and how stuff is doing. And so simple things like that, you go, oh, a city is not designed to support a different way of doing work, a work that involves caretaking. Also, this expectation that the ideal worker is somebody that can be fully engaged and present in an office situation 40 to 45 hours a week just doesn't work for people with caretaking responsibilities. It fits that old idea of one member of a parenting couple working and one member staying at home, but the reality is we need some flexibility in our schedules to be accommodating caretaking. It doesn't mean backing away from the work that's expected to be done by caretakers, but it's acknowledging that needed a different way of doing it. And Dr. Rubio, I appreciated what you said, that you had a husband whose work schedule allowed you to do that. You had someone in your parenting couple that had greater ability to care. And that's what has to happen for many people with big jobs. If they don't have one partner that's able to have some flexibility, it's an issue. And opportunity is that the pandemic has challenged both of these factors. We've learned that working at home can work. And we've also seen that you can get a lot of work done. If you're not in your butt in a seat 40 hours a week at the office, you can still be effective. And so it's an opportunity for us to be advocating for those kinds of policies to change. I think it will allow people the workplace flexibility to excel as caretakers and employees.
Yes, thank you. Just one follow-up question for you is, why do you think the burden has historically fallen on individual workers to advocate for these types of paid sick and family leave policies?
That's a really deep conversation. I think part of it is that our vision for work and employees' life doesn't present an integrated view of our callings, with the idea that an employee is not just a worker, it's a whole person, and that their calling will be to a certain form of work, and it also includes caretaking. And so when we lack that integrated vision, and it isn't translated into the workforce, it's really hard to even have a place to make for a case for yourself. You know, what's been so exciting is we've seen one of the graduates of our 52A fellowship, a younger man, realized that his company did not have family leave policies. And he actually did a formal presentation to his HR committee saying, I think we can grow in this area. And a year later, when they revisited their annual HR policies, they changed them. That company now has family leave. But it took a really strong argument from within of saying it's good for the company. And I find, as we talk to Christian business leaders, they're open to the idea, but often they've never been challenged to do that. Their vision of Christian business leadership does not extend to caring for the whole person, and that they have it's maybe strong to say that, but a moral obligation to consider the needs of the whole person that they employ. And so that's why we exist. We lean really heavily on our business leaders to think more holistically about how they run their companies.
Thank you. That's a really good segue into our next question. That's for all of our panelists, but I'll start with you, Dr. Rubio. You know, each of you kind of comes to this conversation with a theological vantage point. How does the failure to protect some workers, or the failure to acknowledge caregiving needs, and I think, as Joana said, this need to integrate who you are at work and who you are at home, how does that affect workers spiritually at a soul level?
That's a great question. And I was thinking about this in I wrote my first paper on family leave in graduate school out of my experience that something's not right here, and also looking around and seeing what other people were dealing with and thinking, this doesn't make sense with the Christian tradition that I'm studying. And yet I wouldn't say that experiencing not being treated as a whole person, right, affected me spiritually, because in a way, I mean, pointing back to Joanna's question, point, I thought that it was, in a way, it was my job. It was like I worked it out. I thought of it individually because that's the way that the business environment, the university environment schooled me to think of it. And yet I look around today and I see especially young adults feeling this spiritually in a different way. I have young adult sons who are in the workplace and feeling, knowing they're under Obamacare because they're under 25, but that's going away soon, right? Because, and then they have jobs without health care. What does that even mean? Right? How can they not have health care? And so, and the language that they sometimes use to describe this is language of the Christian tradition, but they're not using it consciously. They're just like, I'm a person, right? I'm a person. Like I need, and the broader conversation right now around mental health care as well. How can we not provide these things for people who are struggling? So I do hear this language coming out broadly right now, not necessarily just by Christians, of people who are struggling, and we're struggling in a whole different level now because of the gig economy, because of so many jobs that just don't provide what jobs used to provide. And so, yeah, people are feeling like, I'm not slacking here, right? I'm not asking for the world here. I'm just asking that you understand me as a person who has a body and a soul, right? And when employers deny that, it can be deeply unsettling. And when conversely they affirm it by saying, yeah, you can take a day off, take a mental health day, take a personal day. That feels, it's not just like, oh, good. It's like, yeah, I'm me. I'm more than just this work that I do for you.
Dr. Salguaro, as a pastor, what have you seen and how this affects workers spiritually?
Look, I think that just getting back to what our two colleagues have said, we really need to do a lot more work, not in pastoral conversations and entrepreneurial and business conversations about a theology of work, and rhythms, the rhythms of life, right? It is a fundamental flaw of theological anthropology. What does it mean to be human? Especially through COVID-19, there is a continual challenge that we continue to become cyborgs, half human, half Zoom. And what does that mean in terms of work rhythms, that people can reach you at any time on your cell phone or on your text or on your WhatsApp? And what does rest look like in terms of both of self-care, but also in terms of productivity? That rhythms don't just make you a healthier, more whole person, they also increase productivity. I think these false bifurcations that productivity and self-care are enemies are something that we need to look at. I think that as a pastor, what I've seen, and tragically, is a sense of depression that I'm not enough, that self-worth is tied to work rhythms that are just inhumane. I mean, they're just unsustainable over long periods of time. And so my children, I have two sons, 15 and 12, and I have some flexibility. I'm a pastor. I work in the public sphere. My wife has some flexibility. She's an executive. She's a business administrator. But my sister-in-law is a single mom with two children who works in the service sector of travel. If there were not a larger family to support childcare, she would be homeless and broke. And so it is not just that there are rhythms for people like us who have flexibility and have bought into this kind of individualized understanding of productivity rather than communal. and broken understandings of health, mental health, physical health. But it is also that we forget that there are entire groups of people who don't have a support network, who are either not married or widowed or divorced, or I mean the list is rather long, where now what is our responsibility as pastors, as Christians, but as a society, for those parents who are raising children by themselves, or those people who are sustaining two parents or two grandparents at home by themselves. And I think, I'm just going to use the language that we use in my house, que de la familia, que de la familia. What, the first institution, right? What do we do with the family? And so we have to find a way of a theology of work, a theology of community, but also a theology of productivity that is deeply integrated, that respects our humanity, that we are not machines, that we have limits, and to quote people like Pete Scazzaro and others, that limitations can be a gift in many ways.
Yes, that was great. The individual versus communal as part of how do you create this theology. Joanna, did you have anything to add about what you've seen and how it affects workers spiritually, to be treated as, Dr. Salguaro mentioned, as machines?
Yeah, I think there's significant churn when people feel like their callings are in conflict with each other, and often in Christian circles, for women especially, we have elevated our relational callings to marriage and family, and that should be a priority of overall. And I honestly would argue biblically, I think it's much more integrated than that they all are important to God. We live and try to steward those in tension with each other. But God calls us to work in all kinds of forms, paid, unpaid, family, outside the house. And so when we lack a clear theology of work, a vision for the dignity of the worker, the God-given purpose he puts in all of our lives, it creates churn as we get caught in these barriers and structures that make it hard to really balance our callings.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Rubio and Dr. Salguaro. As we noted in the beginning, the shape of work in the United States, benefits such as paid sick days or paid time off were largely addressed individually or through unions. Workers received what they could bargain for from their employer. If a person needs better pay or protections for illness or caregiving, then he or she should work their way up the ladder and qualify for a job that offers these benefits. How would you assess this model from a standpoint of Christian social ethics, and what theological concepts should inform how we think about this?
Well, I would say that in the Catholic tradition, we really do have a strong theology of work, and we've had it since the 1890s, the beginning of Catholic social teaching. The first document was called Rerum Novarum, on the condition of the working class, and it was coming out of the Industrial Revolution. And there it's really clear that workers are humans first, and that the human dignity that is just yours because you're human means that you are deserving of certain things. And among those things are just working conditions that treat you as a person, which means that you, among other things, have time to rest and time to worship. And also that you deserve a living wage, essentially, so that you can live not extravagantly, in frugal comfort is the phrase, but that you can live a decent life. And as the tradition has developed, then we've said it's not just about the wage, but it's about the broader set of benefits that go along with that, because we share this commitment that family is foundational. And so we have to think of the workers not just as isolated beings, but as beings in relation with family responsibilities. And so it's the employer's responsibility to do that, not solely. I think that's important, but we have a concept that there are that government has responsibilities, that culture has responsibilities. It's not all on the employer, but yeah, we would look at that situation and say that is a fundamental violation of human dignity.
Well, I think that we Protestants can learn a lot from Catholic social teaching. I think and so I'm an evangelical Protestant, Pentecostal, which is even in another Assemblies of God, and I think that we still wrestle with the legacy of Max Weber and the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, right? And in some ways we're conversing with Adam Smith, right? And so those conversations deeply influence Protestant understandings of work and productivity, at least in the global north, and to a large degree around the world. And so the question becomes is, how does the Holy Writ recommend us to treat the worker? We have a holy witness in Scripture, right? The worker is worthy of his or her hire. Do not oppress the worker. Do not take from him or her their rightful wages. And so there is in the Torah, in the prophets, in the teachings of the New Testament, a real respect for the dignity of work and the proper compensation of work. At the same time, there's a real understanding of integrated humanity. That is a gift of the Hebrew tradition, an integrated anthropology that the human being, I think Joanne talked about it, that we navigate multiple vocations. I am pastor and husband. I am pastor and father. I am, my wife is pastor and wife, pastor and mother, and pastor and executive. And so if we understand that we have an integrated humanity, that integrated anthropology that the prophets spoke to and that the New Testament spoke to should inform policies, practices in private businesses, and I would even dare say, perhaps even more so in our churches and our places of worship, that we often, instead of leading the way, have fallen behind because we have the exceptions because we're smaller places of work. We don't meet the 500 employee level, and so it's a very fascinating thing that as we wrestle with Weber, it's not in conversation with the Torah sometimes, or it's not in conversation with some of the prophetic understandings of integrated humanity. And I think we can do a better job. And let me just say this. This conversation is so new to so many people. Right. In the Latino community, we've been to certain workshops on faith and work and the theology of vocation, or theology of work, but it is, I feel, and that's just my experience, nascent in the lingua franca. It is in its, perhaps there are people who've worked on it for decades or years, but I'm talking about in the vox populi. I'm talking about in the congregation. I'm talking about in people who when they vote, are they thinking of a theology of vocation? It is fundamentally a failure on my part as a pastor to teach about theology of vocation and integrated humanity that has led us to certain postures, because I think we are more closely followers of certain economic theories than we are of the Holy Writ and the prophetic understandings of humanity.
Thank you. We're about to open the floor for questions, but in closing, I thought I would give each of you guys a chance to make closing comments, but also to think about, as the world is beginning to open up again, and we are, the title was kind of, this is where we've been, this is how we've always thought about this. But if we look at this as, an opportunity, sort of disruptive, to vision something new, to imagine something new. From your perspective, what would that new vision look like? What is a theological vision that you would offer as an alternative to what we have had, even in the season of COVID-19, but even as Joana so helpfully pointed out before, what would a Christian, a faith say, a vision of work that it treats work as valuable, and what would you say kind of a healthy vision of work looks like? Joana, if you'd start us off.
Thanks. I think a challenge to all of us is not to look away from what the pandemic has revealed, to really sink into some of these just sweeping changes we've seen and allow them to rethink the way we think about work. I love what you said, Dr. Salguaro, about discipling our people for work, because that I think is a critical component in this conversation, that an organization like CPJ can really think at a high level about policy change and push for sweeping changes. But the reality is we need our churches to be discipling people of influence, to steward their influence through work. And I think about so many business leaders I know that have not been challenged to really think how the gospel, how a love for neighbor would transform their business operations. And what's amazing is when you see a business leader whose heart is alive for the gospel, operationalized through their work, it transforms their faith experience, and they lead profitable companies. I can give you a list of examples as long as my arm. But we aren't discipling people for that end. We're not giving them the gift of seeing God work through their work. And so we can partner with an organization like CPJ at a different level through coming alongside business leaders and discipling them towards greater public service through their leadership.
Thank you. Dr. Rubio?
Yeah, I'm really struck by the commonality in the different traditions that are represented here, and it feels like our visions are somewhat similar. There's a phrase in a document of Pope John Paul II that kind of stays with us. Work is for man or the person, not the person for work. And if you really, he really offered a spirituality of work. And if you really sit with that and think, okay, right, this is a part of, but it's not what I'm for. It's not what anyone is for. And that really all persons are called to flourishing. And we want to make that possible for everyone. And so as Christians, some of us have a lot of power over workplaces. Some of us don't, but many of us might have power in other ways. And we can think about, am I thinking about the flourishing of persons when I buy things, right? Do the places where I buy things have a vision of flourishing for their workers? Or are they exploiting workers and pushing them past their limits? What am I paying my babysitter, right? What am I giving to the delivery person? What about, I'm looking at faculty in my workplace. Am I looking at the administrative assistants? Am I looking at others who have less? And am I really seeking flourishing for all of them? So I think if we start with that vision that all human beings are called to live a flourishing life, what can we do to make that possible? That's where I'd start.
And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Salguaro.
I think that I have a lot to learn from my dear sisters on this chat, and so I just want to begin by that. I think I would add or echo that work is not a product of the fall in the creation narrative, that humanity worked prior to the fall. And so work is beautiful, work is honorable work is honorable, whether it's paid, it's unpaid, volunteer work. I think that we have to reclaim the beauty and the honor and the dignity of work pre-fall, that God told the human creatures in the Genesis narrative, hey, you're going to steward and you're going to work and you're going to till. And that was not a chastisement or punishment, but was an invitation to co-labor with God's work of beauty and sustaining and flourishing, to quote Dr. Rubio. I think that at the same time, we need to be acutely aware of how disparate people on the socioeconomic ladder, and let me give 2 examples as I close. A dear friend of mine who's a pastor who's passed away worked with car wash workers who were not unionized. I get my car washed, and I often see what they make or don't make, right? And so how does our understanding of work and the dignity of work impact people like the car wash worker, or like some of the people that Dr. Rubio and others have mentioned? And if we believe, and I do, that God has called us to work towards the flourishing of humankind and all of creation, that part of that work is work, or vocation, whether it's manual labor or intellectual productivity or aesthetic productivity in whatever it is, or child rearing or elder care, that has to be honored in a way that contributes to the flourishing of humankind, of human families, and of our society. So if we have a theology of work that talks about the dignity of work, integrated with the flourishing of humankind and creation, I think that will help us build on principles in the public and private sphere that are more just.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to open the conversation for questions from the panel, from the participants. If you could either use the raise your hand function or put your questions in the chat. We also are open to, we want sort of the conversation we have here to feed into and flow into the work we're doing at Center for Public Justice. So Deborah is also going to put 2 questions into the chat about what was something a speaker shared that resonated with you in your own experience or what you've observed during the pandemic. And then given what has been shared, what do you think family-friendly work would look like going forward? So we'll take questions. We have time for a few questions or comments.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to use the raise your hand function. I don't see that on my screen, but hi, my name is Morgan. I'm a communications intern at CPJ, so I'm here with Deborah. And I just wanted to thank you all for your amazing insight during this panel. I learned a lot, but I have 2 questions. I want to start with just one in case we run out of time so other people can ask questions if they have any. But first, I just wanted to ask really all the panelists, because you've all really touched on this subject, but particularly Dr. Salguaro. So you brought up how there's sort of this strong reliance on family, particularly in the Latin community, but there's a strong reliance on family for support in areas where, like, you know, the government sort of fails us, like childcare and things of that nature. And those of us who are fortunate enough to have family members to rely on for support, like we certainly have been during these COVID times, when government support has been kind of minimal and not very fast paced. So my initial question is just like, do you think that our human nature to rely on family support in our day-to-day lives has been kind of an impediment in advancing family-oriented policy, like guaranteed maternal leave and childcare subsidies and things like that, because it's just so much easier to lean on family than it is to advocate for that change just because it's so slow?
That is a great question, and I had not really thought through that, and so I thank you for that gift of that question. That question is a gift. I think, and now I'm using anecdotal evidence. I think there's 2 reasons some groups don't advocate. Number one is we are not aware of our own power. We are not aware of our own power, and that actually together we can do more than we think we can. That we have access to the levers of, now if we're talking specifically about policy or practices in public or private workplaces, I think that sometimes we are led to believe that things cannot change. So as Dr. Rubio said, it's my response, I'll make it work. I'll make it work. I'll call my aunt. And so I think there's some of that. There's a lack of education of stewarding of influence, especially in a democratic society, right? Especially in a democratic society. I do think that there is some of that of, hey, this is, I'm not gonna, look, there's just fundamental theological and political philosophies that some people hold at the deepest core of their convictions. It's saying, I don't need to ask anybody to change anything. This is my responsibility. That there's a deeply formed view of individual or family responsibility versus this kind of policy, and that doesn't happen overnight, right? My grandmother would never think to advocate to change the law to help her with the 14 children she had. She was just calling her sisters, and they made it work. and I'm saying sisters with intentionality, because there's a whole kind of sexism tied around that, right? My mother probably thought about it a little more. And my mother's almost in her 70s. And so there's this kind of, right, why am I grateful for CPJ and others? Because there's this kind of exposure to how influential our voices are around issues of policy that impact family, that impact work, that impact wages, that impact practices in the workplaces by entrepreneurs. And so I never had that conversation. I grew up in a Spanish Pentecostal church of 200 people. I never had the conversation, let's go lobby Congress. It's like, who in the church is going to help Hermana Maria with her 3 kids next week? We just made it work. And there's nothing wrong with that empowerment and that communal thing. But in a broad base of 360 million people, I don't know how sustainable it was. So my answer to that is, I just am not sure that those conversations happened when in the church I grew up with, and that we knew we could do it. And I also do think that there are philosophical and communal historical convictions about how we fix things, tied to sometimes regrettably issues of shaming and issues of power that have really limited our ability to empower great masses of people. So we could help 10 families, 15 families as a church, but we couldn't help 10,000 families.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a great question, Morgan. So our next question is from Lisa, and she's asked, okay, so she has some comments, and then her question is, I'm also gratified to hear the conversation being brought in to acknowledge caregiving responsibilities, not just to children, but also the elderly. But I fear that so many legal solutions and social attitudes sort of grudgingly accommodate child raising among younger women, but only give lip service to elder care, not to mention lifelong caregiving responsibilities for people with disabilities. I sense employers are okay with accommodating young women just starting their careers, but when a woman starts another cycle of caregiving later on, there's a sort of weariness, like, you had your chance. Am I just imagining this? And then how do we address these attitudes? Dr. Rubio?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thought is that you're right, that we should talk about these things holistically. It's not just early child raising. But what that does actually is it helps us to have a more inclusive conversation. So not everybody is going to have or adopt children, but probably almost everyone will have a sick family member to care for, a dying family member to care for. Like, if you look across the life cycle, then there are so many different things. And so when I organized within my corner of academia around these issues, we talked about family care, right? Not just about pregnancy. And so once we know that, then we see that it's a universal thing that we all want to advocate because it's going to affect all of us.
Yeah, and I will just add, I think if you think about it as a woman's issue, I mean, that is, I think that thought is extremely detrimental, whether it's young women or just women as caregivers. Men have caregiving responsibilities, but then I think also to Dr. Salguaro's point, we should be thinking about the flourishing of all people when we talk about a theology of work. Were there any other, I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we'll close if there are any other questions from participants or comments. Okay, well, if not, I would like to thank our panelists and the attendees for your time today and your good questions and thoughts. I think that what we've heard here today is that there is sort of an inequity between access to leave among salaried or salaried workers and low-wage workers, those with family supports and those without. But these challenges also should inspire us to help move this conversation beyond individual to the communal. We should be encouraging a theology of work that sees people as persons with many callings, and how do we support them in all of those callings. And then, as pastor, theologian, Dr. Salguaro helped us to think about discipling our people, to consider the flourishing of all, and to honor the dignity, and what would it look like to honor the dignity of work. I'll close by inviting you to join CPJ in our advocacy for several pro-family work policies to be included in the next round of pandemic recovery. Permanent paid family and parental leave, a forward-looking plan to ensure that all workers have access to paid sick days for illness, recovery, and caregiving, and protection for pregnant mothers, including pregnant workers. Deborah has so helpfully added a link to that letter in our Google chat. And then I would lastly like to invite you to our final installment of webinars, where we'll talk more in depth with church leaders and nonprofit leaders and business leaders who have experience of incorporating family-friendly policies into their workplaces and approach to work. Thank you all again for joining us and giving us an hour of your time on a Wednesday. I hope that the rest of your week goes well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.